Meeting will come to order. May I have a roll call, please?
Babcock?
Here.
Chapman?
Here.
Eckberg?
Here.
Khan?
Here.
Morrison?
Here.
Seifert?
Here.
Gurian?
Here. We'll start the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance, led by some children from Conyers Learning Academy. And I'm going to ask the principal, Dr. Kathy Plimer, to come up and introduce those kids. And I'll thank them in advance for coming on this cold evening to lead us in the pledge.
Perfect.
Dr. Thompson, members of the Board of Education, and the community. Mrs. Jensen's class was chosen to attend the board meeting tonight to highlight District 15's important work in the area of preschool education. The focus of this particular classroom is kindergarten readiness. Our preschool students learn the pledge in a call and response format. So we will be saying the pledge together tonight in this way. Our Board of Education members, parents, and community members can join us to experience one of the ways in which we teach our young children to learn complex and challenging tasks. Mrs. Jensen, Mrs. Barlow, our speech therapist, and Ms. Kat Hill, our program assistant, will be leading the pledge in small sections, and we together will repeat after her. All right, boys and girls.
So if you come this way, the Board of Education has a light-up pen. Thank you for coming out this cold evening and leading in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you for coming. And it lights up. Thank you for coming.
Now that's an inspiring group, huh?
It is.
As always, the mission of School District 15 is to produce world-class learners by building a connected learning community. Dr. Thompson?
The first item in my section is a presentation on the Student Achievement Report. This is our annual report, and presenting tonight will be Drs. Tom Edgar and Laura Swanlin. I didn't see her hiding back there. Right. Let's see.
I think for next year, so Dr. Thompson, thank you, members of the board. Next year, we're hoping to follow a easier act. So, be 1 second here for this to warm up, I think. So while this is warming up, last year we started off with just, my excitement for presenting by talking about the important work that a researcher in education has done. His name was John Hattie, and he talked about understanding your impact and the importance of understanding your impact. And what the message really was is if you are always aware of the impact you're having, it will allow you to be responsive. It will allow you to be thoughtful and planful. It's very important. There's another gentleman in our field. His name is Robert Marzano. He's probably just as well known. His breadth of work is just as expansive. And he has also influenced education to a high degree. Recently, he's engaged in trying to determine what the most important variables related to effective leadership are. What are those things that help people move schools and school districts from one point to another? And he found 5 things, 5 major things that different leaders can use to influence staff and move students from point A to point B. One of those things is the regular use and incorporation of data in work. How can we be informed about where we're going, where we're at, and identify priorities for us to continue our focus on? Right behind that is, of course, using relationships to work with others to move them and use that data. So today, we're excited again to visit you. This is our second time to talk about how our information is helping us move things forward. So this is an overview of what we are going to talk about. Palatine is a changing district. We have to be conscious of who we're serving and how those changes have occurred to basically build a population that's very different than years ago. We'll highlight our performance and growth in reading and math, talk about how our students who are tested in their native language, Spanish, are doing, and how they're growing as compared to the other students who take tests in English. We'll talk about a new way of looking at Palatine graduates' outcomes in high school. Before we had the Explore test, that has become defunct. It's no longer used. So we've looked for ways that we are hoping will have longevity, but also will speak, in a knowable and valuable way about how our students continue to exceed even after they leave District 15. And finally, we'll talk about the achievement gaps that we have, like any district within our district. That's a board goal, and it's important to be mindful of where we're at so we know where we're going.
So this graph indicates our enrollment trends by groups in the past 10 years. So the top line shows minority enrollment, and you can see the dramatic change that occurred about 5 years ago and how our trend is pretty stable still, with about 60% of our students from non-white minority status. And the next line, it shows low income, again, similar trends. And then we have our students who are limited English proficient, and then our students with individual education plans. So these would be groups that would typically can be considered at risk in terms of achievement. And some of the highlights here is that the limited LEP groups and the IEP groups have stayed relatively low. And so this shows some of the highlights of how our intervention programs and our overall programs have assisted students despite the changes in enrollment.
The next section is student achievement, which looks at results from the state mandated exam, the PARCC exam, which is a comprehensive, very rigorous exam, which looks at our students' skill levels in English language arts reading and math. It's also summarizing information from our Measures of Academic Progress test, which is our internal achievement test measure that we've had for the last several years that allows us to look at how we're doing in a consistent way and use that information to plan for our students. So this first graph reflects how we've done as a district in the PARCC exam for English language arts and the mathematics test. If you remember from last year, we have a fairly similar pattern. We exceed the state in each grade level in both reading and math. If you'll note, reading continues to be our stronger area. We have a higher performing level at each grade as compared to what we have in math as a general trend. That's something we noted last year, and it's something that has continued into this year. We have things, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we're addressing that, but that's a consistent trend from year 1 to year 2. We haven't decided how we're going to be using the PARCC yet for tracking our progress. PARCC is an ongoing, changing assessment. Last year, we presented on results that were a combination of 2 tests given, once in March, once in May. Last year, they changed that into a single test. And now we are also transitioning from paper or pencil exams to online, so a lot of change. The importance, though, is looking at the trend and identifying we have an area that is consistently showing itself as a priority for our district. When we look at our internal measure, MAP, we have a pattern over the last 5 years. So what we've done is we've taken this test and we've calculated the number of students that would be conventionally considered at grade level. Typically, if you look at how this would be displayed as a national average, it would be 50%. 50% at any one year would be considered at grade level. If you look at the red line, that's our reading performance. Over the past years, we've had a fairly stable trend. The first 3 years are higher than the second 3. 50% would be the national average. We're still exceeding the national average. If you take students who speak Spanish as their native language, and you test them in that native language, you see that a consistently high number of those students meet that benchmark, a very positive result. In math, we see a fairly similar stable trend. The students who are tested in Spanish had a small dip 2 years ago, but that's, of course, come back up, so that was likely some anomaly. And we've had a very stable trend in math. If you note, math tends to be an area, again, that's weaker than reading. If you look at the last year, we've had a nice improvement from 50 to 57%. If we break that down in the next slide by grade level, we see 2 things. The blue bars represent our math performance by grade level, the same metric, percent of students meeting a grade standard. The red dots represent reading. If you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that reading consistently exceeds math. If you look at, and that was 2 years ago, if you look at the graph on the right from this last year, you'll see that we've closed the gap between math and reading in most grades. If you were to look at this a little more closely, you'll see that 2 years ago, the second graders who scored at, say, 56% in math are then the following year's third graders who then scored at 63%. And you'll note that that's a regular pattern that you can see between each of the grades. The year before, you see a general increase. Now, what's really positive about this graph is 2 things. Even though we see the highest performing grades are the higher grades, there's an increasing trend, which you could interpret as the longer you spend in Palatine, the more likely you are to meet this standard. But where we see the greatest shift, the greatest progress in MAP, is where we were largely piloting our math curriculum. So we started to see, ideally, what's an impact associated with that. So that's a positive note from this graph. So even though math is an area that we continue to prioritize, we're starting to see some of the hard work that the Department of Instruction is doing as having some payoff. So in looking at district outcomes past grade 8, we've started to transition to measures that would show how our students are doing in high school and beyond as a result of a District 15 education. So what we started to do is piece together indicators of what would be considered success in college readiness. These are the first 2, and we plan to continue to add to this as we move beyond just having the Explore. Now, District 211 and the state has adopted the SAT, and they are working with the pre-SAT. We don't yet have that information until they have all the bugs worked out. Likely that's something we'll add later on. But what we have here is a comparison of District 15 totals and District 211 and non-District 15 totals for graduation rate and the percent of students taking 1 or more advanced placement courses. As you can see, District 15 exceeds the comparison students in both categories. 2 very positive outcomes.
Tom,
No.
quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I know we've taken the park exam both, I think last year was split up, some on a laptop, some paper and pencil. Is there any correlation between our kids more proficient with a laptop where it may skew the test higher or lower?
Yes. So initially, when the state first began with the park exam a couple of years ago, they published statistics on how students who took it online did compared to how students who took it paper and pencil did. On a regular basis, students who took it with a paper and pencil version outperformed students who took it online. And that's something that is borne out by research on test formats. Typically, if you take something online, you will do less well than if you took something very similar in paper pencil, perhaps due to familiarity, things like that. One of the main reasons that we continue to move to an online format is because the state has a 3-year expectation where there's only paper and pencil on a wholesale level available for 3 years. This is the final year. So even though there's perhaps an advantage in some way of taking it in paper pencil, the state is moving to uniform online testing. And ideally, as our students become more familiar with that format, we'll see those differences diminish. Mhm.
Do we know the number of, or percentage of students in 211 that did not graduate from 15?
Well, let's see here. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way.
I'm just trying to get an
Yep.
idea of what kind of numbers we're basing.
So if you look at the graduation rate, so those District 15 red is the graduation rate for students who went through District 15, 94.8%. So if you were to subtract that from 100, you basically have 5.2.
Okay.
That did not.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we don't know if all those came from 15 or not.
Well,
Transferred in?
Right,
or-
that's what, yeah, we don't know if they're from,
they had some history in District
Right.
15. They might not have had their entire history there.
And Tom, just another quick question. In terms of the data available to you to come up with all this, you have statewide data and obviously our district. Is there data available on other districts?
You can go to other districts through the state report card to get, global gross indications of how they're doing on the state exam.
I mean, because I think that, this is great, just to, you can control for certain things and kind of compare what we're doing with, other districts that have similar, other control factors or demographics or whatever.
Yeah, the difficulty, we started looking when I first came last year and we started looking at how we're doing and we wanted to take a more longitudinal look. It was actually feedback that you had given last time, saying it'd be nice to look at kind of some of these things in a more time-extended way. We started looking at ISAT and things like that, things that are now defunct, and how the district had done compared to other districts in ISAT. And so, like you're suggesting, it's nice to make comparisons, right?
Sure.
And one of the things you have to be conscious of is, are you comparing our students with the advantages and disadvantages, challenges, all those things to like students?
Sure.
The difficulty is when you look at demographic makeup and size and things like that, our neighboring districts really aren't a good comparison in many ways. When you find districts that have similar makeups, they tend to be different in many other ways, size, rural, things. So it's
Sure.
very difficult to make district by district comparisons with the state exam because there's a lot of makeup differences that you could interpret the differences to be related to.
Yeah, no, I think this is effective just because of, you
Mhm.
can see the improvement over time. So those are all great things
Yeah.
that we can keep track of.
Thank you.
So now we're going to highlight academic growth. This graph indicates the percent of students who made a year's growth in a year's time over the past few years in reading and in math. So within our internal assessment map, the students take it in the fall and in the spring, and for each student, there's a way of knowing if they made a year's worth of growth. So we're looking at the percent of students who met that target. So as you can see, the trend is fairly stable for reading and for math, especially from last year into this past year in 2016. And over 50% of our students are making their growth targets. So on average, you have anywhere between about 60 to 75% over the past few years of students meeting 1 year's growth in 1 year's time.
The national average is 50%, just as a comparison.
And isn't there a percentage that gets you to like the top 5% of students? Is that above 70%?
Mm-hmm.
So if 70% of your kids are meeting their growth targets, you are in the top 5% nationally.
Roughly,
So that
yes.
gives you
So,
a
yeah.
perspective on these numbers.
And what are growth targets?
So each student, so the test we use, MAP, what it does is it looks at how a student performs in the fall and their grade. It compares them to all other students who had a similar starting point for their grade, and it looks at what on average did those students make in a year's worth of growth. So it's kind of like taking height. We take all males at 5 feet, all females at 5'1", and we look at how much growth they made if they were all 11. And so a year's growth is based upon how did you compare to that comparison group. If you exceeded 50%, which means you were right in the middle, you were considered meeting that growth target.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's a little confusing because it sounds as though there's a difference between a year's growth in the sense that everybody would be expected to get to that level in a year. You know, when you hear that phrase?
Sure, sure.
It's, the expectation is a year's growth is what 50% of the people nationwide would reach in a year, which is significantly different. Because if you look at this, you could say, well, we're only getting 67% of our kids meeting a goal that should be 100%, but the goal is to, I don't think we could ever get that.
No.
What did you say? What does it take to get it in the top 5%? Did you say it's like 70%?
72
So
or something.
We're pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at that, to me, this to me is the most telling standard when you look at this. You look at, you got a standard that says, if you look at that 50% mark and you look at where our kids are doing, I think that's really remarkable.
And it's basically saying that there's a high percentage, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's 67% of students who are meeting what should be expected in terms of growth.
No,
and
that's the difference. If you use that standard to say this 100% would be what every student is expected to grow, that's different. What this test says is, if you apply this to all of our students, every student nationwide, 50% of the kids would reach, and that's your standard. So anything above that is, we're getting more kids above what
Got
would
it.
be the norm.
Yeah, that 100% is not it's
would
not-
never-
you're never
never
gonna get to
be.
100%. Understood, yeah.
That is the difficulty of the way that this is conveyed, is that, you know, it looks deceiving to see 67 or 50 or even 80 when, you know, we normally think of, we want 100 as our standard, every kid. But the reality of the way this test is constructed, as Dr. Chapman indicated, it's just an impossibility to get to that. So we look at this by saying, you know, 50% is what is expected. For a grade level, it would be typical for you to have 50% of your students meet that. And that means one student might be 1 point below, you know, minimal things, they're counted as a no. To have 70 to 60% is very high when you look at how schools actually exceed. It's very few that get that far. So,
Understood.
So this graph indicates the similar kind of data we're talking about in terms of amount of growth on the MAP test and percent of students who met their growth targets. The difference is that we're breaking it down by grade here, and you see math and reading, and there's 2015, and then next to it's 2016. So we're able to make comparisons in terms of how we did with students meeting growth targets from last year into this year. And one of the highlights, again, is looking at math, which is the blue bar, about how we saw an increase in the percent of students meeting their growth in math from last year to this year. So our trend was both with achievement increasing and growth increased as well.
so one of the board goals that we have is to address the achievement gap. And so one of the things that we wanted to highlight was just particular information showing where we're at with different things and our trends over time, to give kind of an idea about where we are prioritizing our time and where we stand now, so that we can come back in a year and look at where we've come.
So this is showing our average spring reading score in MAP for different groups in the district. The top line is the national norms for that grade level in spring of 2016, and then you'll see a line for Hispanic, low income, and LEP, and the grades over time. So some of the highlights here is that we see a similar trend of improvement for all, especially for Hispanic and low income. And the LEP line shows the gap increasing, but some of the notes here is that we have about 70% of our students in the limited English proficiency program that exit in third grade. So the fourth through eighth are students who need more time to reach that English proficiency. So it's a smaller number of students as we go up through the grades. But this also highlights are reminders of the focus and supports for our students who receive LEP services. This is the same kind of information, but for math. So the top line shows the national average, and then you'll see the achievement for each grade in spring of last year for the Hispanic, low income, and LEP groups. And then finally, this is another way of looking at any achievement gaps. This is the PARC test. And here we're seeing English and then math, so ELA and math. And the larger the bar is, the more of a gap there is for that group. So, for example, the first one, black, that's comparing to white. And you have low income comparing to non-low income. So this highlights again some of the groups that are showing a little bit more of an achievement gap. For a group such as Asian, if their bar is below the line, that means that they scored above the comparison, which is white.
Yeah, that was a little deceiving when we first saw it.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned when we started, we talked about using data to guide our practices. This last slide just highlights some of the things that we have been doing to actively address some of the information in here. So we continue to make revisions to our math and science practices. Last year, we went through a pilot in K-6. This year, we're going through an adoption year where kindergarten through 6th grade is implementing the Envision math program, and we are piloting in the junior high, looking towards an adoption next year. We're also looking at different science curriculums that more closely align with the new standards. We've expanded our instructional coaches into many of our buildings, so we've given additional resources to support teachers in implementing effective practices. We've begun to adopt a new school improvement process. We have a large initiative to develop systems that regularly use data and involve staff in making decisions about continuous improvement at the school level. We've revised the district's literacy intervention program to make sure we are targeting the students who are most in need of intervention and making sure that students who can benefit from exposure to grade level concepts are served differentially. We've done a lot of work to make sure that our system has become efficient and that our resources within that system are used to support teachers in their practices with students as well. We had an earlier presentation about our success with our positive behavior interventions and supports program. We continue to use our district leadership team to standardize and make that process something more uniform and even stronger across our different schools to make sure that we have a safe learning environment for all of our students. We are in the middle of a Chromebook pilot and adoption where we are trying to use technology to allow our teachers to include more diverse arrays of information and engage their students with 21st century demands that the Common Core is requiring more and more of our students to have. And finally, we are working to update our data systems so that schools and teachers can have more readily available access to current information to plan and monitor the impact they are having on students.
Thank you. Does the board have any further questions?
Just a question about, you mentioned here about science. I mean, I know that all this data is really on reading and math. Is there any similar efforts in tracking, maybe it's a whole different ballgame, but tracking science and, I don't know, social studies?
So actually, the state last year implemented a state-level science exam with the same idea of the park where we would get information about where our students fall. 5th and 8th grade are the 2 grades that are tested, around where are their proficiencies and what areas do we have that are strengths and what areas do we have that are areas of priority. They have not yet returned those results. They are still in the middle of grading and standardizing them, and they're likely to return those maybe in the spring or even the summer. So we'll be going through that exam again this year, again, grade 5 and grade 8, so we'll have more of that information for next year. But that's a new development, and it was something they had with ISAT years ago. It went away for a while, and now it's returned, and so we should be able to have more of that information as we move forward.
Okay.
And as we're looking at PARC and MAP, I mean, we're looking at all of them as to formulate a plan. Those are just two of the tools that we're using. The big markers that we're using then to formulate a plan for our students in our schools.
That's two of our major tools. We have a broad array of assessments that we use for different purposes. Those are the two that are given uniformly. And we emphasize MAP because it's a very reliable, well-known tool that we've had for many years in the district. So we have much of that information, but it's also something that's the one common thread that we have throughout all the years so that we can look at it with kind of an eye of credibility and confidence.
And MAP is we get the results almost immediately.
24 hours.
Got it.
Just a comment, this is really good data because it shows what our kids have done, but I think one of the most impressive is when you shared the data in terms of what happens in terms of high school success, particularly when you look at the percentage of our students that qualify for advanced placement. That really tells something about the academic training that our students are getting here.
Well, and the rigor
district.
of it, for
Absolutely,
sure.
the rigor. So I appreciate you adding that.
Thank you.
Very nice job. Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
hard work.
Should I turn this off?
Yes, please, thank you. All right, the next part of my section, I'm going to be dealing with a couple things that the board has tasked me to do, complete, and a couple informational items. The first is, the board was concerned about making sure that the drinking water and the other water that's in the schools is safe for consumption and preparation of food and that kind of thing. So, with that task that you gave me, I contacted District 211, and District 211 has conducted water sampling at all of their schools and all their water fountains, and I contacted the agency that did the testing for District 211, and they are going to be testing in all of our schools over winter break, and they'll come back with results. It takes about 9 days after they take the samples, but they'll use the same process that they used in District 211, and I'll be able to return those results to you, hopefully either in January or February. But if there's anything that needs to be done, any actionable results from those tests, we will get on that right away.
Perfect.
So I just have one question. When you say that they're gonna follow the same process as 211, does that mean they're going to test each water source multiple times? They'll mirror that?
So, yeah, I shared with you Dr. Cates' letter, and he
Right.
described the process. It's a standard process that's been approved by the EPA, and they want the water to remain unused for 6 to 8 hours before they take the first sample, and then they flush the fountain or the sink, whatever the case may be, and then they take another second sample. And the reason they do that is they want to identify if there is something in the water, is it in the unit itself, the sink or the water fountain, or is it in the pipes? So if it's in the first sample but not in the second sample, they know it's in the actual fountain or sink. If it's in the second sample, then it's somewhere in the pipes, and so that's a bigger problem. So they do that. They are going to sample all the major fountains that kids use in the district, particularly older ones. If there have been new ones that have been installed, they really don't have a concern about the brand new ones because the piping and the construction of those fountains is not really an issue. They are going to check the nurse's office, the teacher's lounge, and the kitchen here, which is used for preparation of food. They're going to test a number of sites, and they'll come back to us with all the results.
Have you come up with a plan to communicate, not just to the board, but to parents? In the event there is a source of lead water in a school of the children, are you going to send out an email notification? How are you planning?
Tim has got something ready to go out in e-news tomorrow, right, about the water testing? Monday.
Okay.
And then, as a follow-up, we will let them know the results once they come back. And we'll let them know if there's a fountain or a sink that needs remediation, we will let them know what that was and what we did to do that.
Okay, great, thanks.
And that'll all be on our website.
Yeah, as well. There was I think, a horrific crash in Chattanooga, Tennessee, between a bus, and I think some board members wanted to know about the qualifications and training for bus drivers. Tom Bramley provided a nice report report for you on what a bus driver goes through before they're actually able to get behind a District 15 school bus. It's pretty rigorous. You can see that they have to have a good driving record, license for a minimum of 3 years. They have to pass a series of tests. They have to go through hours of training. They then have a background check. They take random drug and alcohol tests. They get a background check with the Illinois State Police and the FBI. After they have shown that they're capable of driving in district and gone through the training here, they have to go back and get approved for all the safety precautions and driving skills through the state of Illinois, and they then earn their commercial driver's license. Then when they come back, Tom has a monitor with them for a while that observes them driving. And so we've got an experienced driver that's riding with them to make sure that they're doing everything appropriately. Once they finally have proven that they're going to be a safe driver, they then can get behind the wheel and take their own routes. Tom has workshops throughout the year to update drivers on safety procedures. We recently had them go through training on our PBIS, that's our Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports. And we trained them on how to interact with kids so that the kids were safe on the bus and the drivers could pay attention to driving on the roads. And so a number of trainings that we have, they have to annually go through for a physical. And again, the random drug tests. The other thing that Tom didn't note in here, though, is that we have digital cameras in all of our buses at least 3 locations on the bus. And whenever there is a report of some concern, Tom is able to go to those digital footage and observe drivers actually what they were doing to see if there is a valid concern. So he can watch the cameras when there's been somebody reporting something or if there's a concern about a driver. We also have a phone number on the back of all of our buses, and there have been occasions where people driving the community have called that number and said, I have a concern about the bus. It seems to be, the driver seems to be driving erratically. Tom calls them right away, pull over, and he's gone and provided another driver and taken that driver immediately for a drug and alcohol test and examined the driver and then made sure that the kids got home safely. So Tom does a lot of things to make sure that the drivers are trained and that they're driving as safely as possible. The other thing is that when there have been some safety violations, those drivers have been reprimanded or released. So we take these things very seriously.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
What's your delay? How often the tapes turn over? So if somebody reports something that happened today, obviously you have the tape from today, but if for some reason the child doesn't come forward and reports it in a week or 2 weeks, 3 to 4 days. Thanks.
I just had another question about the bus drivers. Generally speaking, does each bus driver have their own route that they consistently do every day?
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, there's a process where they choose their routes based upon seniority, and that's the route they generally have for the rest of the year. There are occasions when, if a bus driver leaves and another route opens up or something, there's changes. If a bus driver goes on leave because of some issue, we put a substitute in there. If they're off because they're ill, put a substitute in there. But by and large, the drivers have the same routes for the entire year. The safety committee is working on making sure that all the kids that get on these buses are on the right buses, and we've got some procedures that they're looking into so that we can also keep kids getting on buses safely, getting off at the right stops.
Scott, I think that accident that you spoke about earlier was the result of speeding. Can we track that? Is that because it's on GPS? I believe they're all connected to GPS.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that as well. We do have a GPS system, and we are able to track the speed, whether buses stop at railroad crossings, and stop signs, and so we have that information at our fingertips as well.
That's great. Thanks.
Thanks for bringing that up. I forgot that.
I have a question, just out of curiosity. For districts that outsource their busing, do they have the ability to monitor in the same way we do, or have the controls set in place that we do? Or are those standards just kind of turned over to the company, the servicing company? How does that work?
So I think you lose a bit of control when you outsource. I don't think we have direct control, and so I don't know. Some companies, I'm sure, provide like a GPS system so they can do that. Others don't. It just depends on the cost of the service and whether the companies have invested that money. But we have a direct relationship with our bus drivers and our bus aides, where we get to hire them, we get to train them, we get to decide who's driving. Oftentimes, with the outsourcing, they just provide the drivers, and it's only when there's a problem then that you have a chance to really intervene, and you have to ask them to remove the driver.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and I think just as importantly, the community has a relationship. Certainly, the parent has a relationship with each of the drivers, because you have them for most of the year. So I certainly remember the ones we had. I'm sure that you all have too.
And I think there was a company, there was a school district in Bloomington that just recently went from their own service to outsourcing, and they're having extremely difficult time with the service that's being provided by that company, and I think that they kind of regret that. Next thing I wanted to talk about was the curtain wall at Frank C. Whiteley. I provided with the diagram and an information sheet that I sent to staff and parents at Whiteley. What we found at Whiteley is that the construction of the building really hasn't held up to the elements, particularly the wind pushing on the envelope of the building and weakening the structure, and we find that it's really failing, and we need to replace the outside walls of the school. These are curtain walls. They're not structural, but they do provide, security from the elements, and they hold the windows in place and provide light. But these are failing. There's no immediate danger, but we felt like we needed to take care of this as soon as possible so that there wasn't a bigger issue later. We would have to abandon the building during the process. So we are sending bids out to replace the curtain walls, I think this week. Is that right, Jan? This week? David? This week? We're sending them out this week, and then we'll be bringing those bids back to you in January. Hopefully, we'll be able to get them to you for the January 11th meeting. That might be a quick turnaround. We may have a special meeting just to get that approved, because there's a significant lead time on the product that they're using to replace the curtain walls, and we need to get those to the manufacturer as soon as possible. So I'll be bringing back to you bids for this work for this coming summer in January.
Is this normal wear and tear, or is this?
Well, so we have two almost identical buildings, Frank C. Whiteley and Kimball Hill. They're really very identical. I mean, there's just some very, very minor modifications that were done at each spot, but they're basically the same buildings. And first building that was constructed was Whiteley, and the second one was Kimball Hill. And the construction at Kimball Hill was different than the construction at Whiteley. They welded the steel 2x4s, the framing. They welded them together so when the wind blew on it, they didn't move. At Whiteley, they weren't welded, and they used some wood too, I think, and they gave more than they did at Kimball Hill. So we don't see that at Kimball Hill. So that's a long answer to, we think the construction could have been better at Whiteley, but it's too far down the road to really go back and challenge the firm now. I don't even know if they're in existence anymore. So.
And how did it manifest itself? How did we?
We were doing work there, and our workers saw that when they were doing some work at the school. It's not something that came up in our life safety study, because you really have to look inside the walls to identify the problem. And when we had some of our own workers look inside the walls, they realized that the wall was failing, the curtain wall was failing, and after more examination, we realized that we needed to take care of it.
So when they repair it, it probably will include the welding that held up.
Yeah, it'll be a completely different process and construction, and it's really kind of exciting. It's going to really improve the aesthetic part of the building. It's also going to improve the natural light coming into the classrooms, but it's also going to be a better construction where the insulation is on the outside, and it can let the water flow through it, and it never causes problems with water flowing through it. And it's going to really improve the building. I think it's going to extend the life of that building for a lot of years.
Great. Thank you.
The last item is the other task that the board asked me to do. As a result of the referendum, I think the board members indicated that we needed to make sure that going forward, we had engaged the public in as much possible dialogue as we could to get the public's and the community's information on what they would like to see the district working on going forward. What does the community value? What are its priorities? And what kinds of things does the community want us to do, particularly with facilities as we move forward? And so tomorrow, I'll be sending out an information flyer, email to the entire community, inviting them to apply to be a part of this community engagement committee that will design a plan to get input from the community and provide that two-way dialogue. And so the committee will get together and they'll figure out the best ways to engage the community and to get that information. And then after they've gotten the information, they will craft a plan and bring it back to you and share with you their recommendations based upon the community engagement sessions. What I will do is I will select two people that seem to be skilled and talented and make them the co-chairs, and then I'm going to actually let them have the responsibility of deciding who's going to be on that committee. And the committee will get together we've got 3 sessions that we're going to publicize. They're going to get together, design the process. I imagine it'll be, they could decide to have face-to-face meetings where we make presentations and get input from the community. There could be surveys. We have a phone survey where we have a company that calls and gets community input. They'll figure out the best ways to do that. We'll go through that process, and then after the process is completed, we'll come back to you with the findings. So I'm kind of excited about that. I think that it's a nice way going forward. We certainly heard in the referendum that the community wants more input on things going forward. So as a result of the board's directive, that's my plan.
How do you plan on sending this notice for applications out to the public?
So we're going to do
All of the different ways, how
Yeah.
are you planning?
Yeah, we'll do it on Facebook, we'll do it on our e-news, we'll do it with a single email that goes out, a single item email that goes out to everyone that's signed up for our email service. We're sending it to the newspapers, Twitter,
Scott,
on Facebook, on our website.
do we know as a percentage of all the children and all the families in the community, how many emails we have? Is there a ballpark number? I know in the past it wasn't really as high as we expected.
Yeah,
Tim, I don't know if it's,
I can get that.
I'm just curious, I mean, I'm just
I don't
wondering,
have it off the top
we
of my
send
head.
an email individually to each household, is it gonna hit 50%? Is it gonna hit 80%? Are we, I guess, giving everyone a fair chance to,
Yeah,
again,
that's-
with all
that's
the other
goal.
outlets is a great idea with the newspaper and Twitter and everything else. It's a great idea to get it to everyone, so, great.
And if they're not a part of the committee, they can certainly be a part of the engagement
Yeah,
sessions
sure.
for committee design,
Great.
so.
Maybe with the PTA too. I mean, they're pretty well connected within each school.
Yeah.
That might be a good source to
Yeah.
communicate through.
I shared this with our Pacey group, our parent group, yesterday, and so we'll share it with as many people as possible.
Great.
So that's it for my section.
Okay, we are going to move on to reading and acceptance of the minutes. May I have the suggested
I'll
motion?
make a motion to approve the minutes from the following meeting of the Board of Education, November 9th, 2016, regular Board of Education meeting as presented.
Second.
Discussion? Roll call.
Babcock?
Aye.
Chapman?
Aye.
Eckberg?
Aye.
Con?
Aye.
Morrison?
Aye.
Seifert?
Aye.
Grant?
Aye.
Before we move on to, motion carries, by the way, before we move on to board discussion and reports, if there is anyone in the audience that is interested in speaking before the board this evening, please fill out the green form that was in the entranceway and get it to our secretary, and that will be coming up shortly in the meeting. Moving on to board discussion and reports, Ed Red Council, Dr. Chapman.
Well, I wish I had some progress to report, but very little has occurred. The legislature did have a session in November, a veto session, and there was some hope that the budget, which expires at the end of December, would be extended, but that did not happen. So we have to wait. There is a session in early January where the existing legislators will meet in what's called a lame duck session. And then, of course, the regular legislators will be seated later in the month. Now, there's not a significant change in the legislators, so, but it remains to be seen what will happen. We, as you know, suffered through last year without a budget for the entire year. We have a 6-month budget this year, so.
So a lot of these agencies are going to take a hit again as well as the
Exactly.
schools. Thank you. Mr. Seifert, the 1-5 Foundation.
The 1-5 Foundation had their volleyball tournament, their staff volleyball tournament, and again, Winston Campus seems to be the group that continues to win, but Winston won the competitive side of it, Lincoln School won the other side of the volleyball tournament, and then Conyers Learning Academy also had the most attended out of all the schools too, so they got a Spirit Award also, so it's a great tournament. I was over there for a couple hours. It wasn't as nasty as some of the ones in the past, but it was pretty competitive, a lot of fun, so.
It's fun to see the teachers out of their element.
Yes, it is.
Setting too. There was some fierce competition going on.
There was.
Thank you. Moving on to board policy.
Well, as I tried to explain, I decided to help Matt out. Matt is doing a number of things. He's got a safety committee going. He's working on the nutrition committee that is working on a board goal, and that's very exciting. He's got that going. And we, in the most recent edition of Press, we had 176 pages of documents that we had to go through, which is highly unusual. It's the most they've ever had, I think. And most of them were the result of the change from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeed Acts, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And so most of those changes are just changing wording and changing some minor things. And Matt does this a better job than I do, and I realize that next time I'll give you the red line version so you can not have to flip back and forth between the policies and the exhibits. But in order to get through these 176 pages, I think we're going to have to go a little more quickly and streamline them than we have in the past. And so that's why tonight I'm presenting, I think, 9 policies and then a large number of exhibits for your examination as a first reading. Certainly, I think the one that stands out in this group is the legislation that was passed about expenditures by board members and school staff. And so that policy is in here as well, and there will be a resolution that once you adopt the policy, the board will have to pass the resolution. And a part of that resolution is the maximum, the MARA, the maximum acceptable reimbursement amount. And so that's in here, but that's a result of some of the poor choices that many board members and administrators have made, and the legislators made that law so that.
I would want to clarify that.
Not in
When you're
District
Not
15.
not in here. I didn't see anything in here that would affect anything that we've done in the
No,
past, nor we're going to
this
do in the
is-
future. So
this
I
is-
just want to clarify that when
Yeah,
you say
thank
that, we're not looking at ourselves,
No,
not that we should.
it's College DuPage, it's some other school districts, but it's not ours. So this really wouldn't affect anything that we've ever done, except that from now on, we will have to approve reimbursement amounts, but our reimbursement amounts have been very reasonable. Thanks for that clarification.
So are we going to, we're not going to
That's
go
first
through
reading.
any of these, first reading?
This is the first reading, yeah.
Okay, and we've had
June-
those, so we've been able to review some of it, and we'll be,
And June has the red line copies. If you'd like to look at those over the next month before we go to second reading on this, she can make those available.
moving on to citizens address the board. Do we have any sheets? Okay. Then moving on to action items. Item 16, 12, 20, may I have the suggested motion, please, for the personnel report?
I make a motion to approve the the December 14, 2016 personnel report as presented, including the following recommendations. Recommendation for 5 days unpaid suspension and termination for Stacy Coletti. Recommendation for 5 days unpaid suspension and last chance agreement for Tracy Cypera. Recommendation for termination of Magdalena Galvin. Recommendation for termination of Michelle Melzer. Recommendation for termination of Marlene Magazi. And recommendation for termination of Tara Scornia Marcus.
Second.
Discussion. Roll call.
Chapman?
Aye.
Egbert?
Aye.
Con?
Aye.
Morrison?
Aye.
Seifert?
Aye.
Gurian?
Aye.
Babcock?
Aye.
Before we
Motion-
move on, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I just want to compliment Lisa Nuss on her diligence in making sure that her department handles things appropriately so that people that maybe shouldn't be in the system are escorted out. And you can see, I don't know if you remember, but over the years, we've not really had these items listed in the personnel report. But since Lisa's taken over, she's really held people to a high standard, and when they don't meet it, she's worked to find them other employment. So I appreciate that.
Thank
I
you.
think we all do.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to item 161221, approval of.
I make a motion to approve the 2018-19 official school calendar as recommended, noting that District 211 and 15 will share winter and spring break. It's a very significant issue.
Absolutely.
Second.
Discussion? This was posted on our website. Did we have any comments?
0.
Okay. Roll call, please.
Egbert?
Aye.
Con?
Aye.
Morrison?
Aye.
Seifert?
Aye.
Gurian?
Aye.
Babcock?
Aye.
Chapman?
Aye.
Motion carries. Item 161222, read it. Life safety minutes, please.
I make a motion to approve the resolution authorizing life safety amendments, Carl Sandburg Junior High, Pleasant Hill Elementary, and John C. Conyers Learning Academy as presented.
Discussion. Oops, sorry, second?
Second.
Discussion.
But this is the process by, where, when we decide to do the work, that it was included in a life safety study that was done in 2014 by STR Partners. When we decide to actually do the work, we have to file an amendment with the state and get approval for actually doing the work. And so this is the process that we're gonna actually do this work, get the amendments. That's why this resolution is in this packet.
And this is for the second summer. You know, we talked about the 2 summers. This is for the second summer.
This really is for 3 additional projects that we have identified from our life safety study that we'd like to take care of above and beyond the summer work that we had planned.
Okay.
And we believe that there will be enough funds available in the life safety, from the life safety bonds to take care of most or all of these.
That's correct. We got, excuse me, we had savings from the 2016 work that will be able to fund these 3 additional projects.
Okay, that's good.
Perfect. So we had a second. We have any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Con?
Aye.
Morrison?
Aye.
Seifert?
Aye.
Gurian?
Aye.
Babcock?
Aye.
Chapman?
Aye.
Egbert?
Aye.
Motion carries. Item 161223, the bid award for the summer life safety projects. I
Aye.
want to see who's going to be brave enough to read these.
I make a motion to award the contracts for life safety project bids 17005 to 12 different companies listed for a total bid award of $13,506,742, of which $12,457,642 will be expenditure of the 16-17 Fire Prevention and Safety Fund, and $1,049,100 will be an expenditure of the 16-17 Capital Funds Project. And listed below are the totals from the different contractors and bids for a bid total of $13,506,742.
Second.
Discussion. Roll call.
Morrison?
Aye.
Seifert?
Aye.
Gurian?
Aye.
Babcock?
Aye.
Chapman?
Aye.
Egbert?
Aye.
Con?
Aye.
Motion carries. Item 161224, the authorization of certificate of the tax levy. May I have the suggested motion?
I make a motion to approve the certificate of tax levy for 2016 as presented and include the following levy resolutions: certificate of compliance with the Truth in Taxation Law, certificate of tax levy, resolution authorizing special education levy, resolution authorizing reduction of certain fund levies for the 2016 levy year, resolution authorizing final aggregate tax levy of the year 2016.
Second.
Discussion?
This is unchanged since the last month when it was brought to you. It was available for people to view over the last month. This will capture that 0.8% that we're entitled to by law, and then any new growth. So that's the amount that's included in this levy. And remember, we're gonna come back to you in January and possibly talk about giving a rebate through our debt service extension base, and the possibility of giving some relief to taxpayers in that regard. So we'll be coming back to you in January then.
Roll call.
Seifert,
Aye.
Gruyan,
Aye.
Babcock,
Aye.
Chapman,
Aye.
Eckberg,
Aye.
Con,
Aye.
Morrison.
Aye.
Motion carries. Item 16, 12, 30 is the consent calendar. Does anyone wish to remove anything from the consent calendar? May I have the suggested motion?
I make a motion to approve the consent calendar as presented.
Second.
Roll call.
Gruyan,
Aye.
Babcock,
Aye.
Chapman,
Aye.
Eckberg,
Aye.
Con,
Aye.
Morrison,
Aye.
Seifert.
Aye.
So we had 4 Freedom of Information requests in the last period. On November 4th, 2016, a request was received from North America Procurement Council, Grand Junction, Colorado. The response to this request was sent on November 11th. On November 9th, 2016, a request was received from Jake Griffin, Assistant Managing Editor for Watchdog Reporting, Daily Herald, Arlington Heights, Illinois. The response to this request was sent on November 16th. On November 24th, 2016, a request was received from Gabriela Luarcella, Data Acquisition Specialist, Smart Procure, Deerfield Beach, Florida. The response to this request was sent on December 1st. And on December 1st, a request was received from Nathan Mihalich, Executive Director, Illinois Retired Teachers Association, Springfield, Illinois. The response to this request was sent on December 6th.
Okay, very quickly before we adjourn, to all the board members, happy holidays and thank you for all that you do. And to our District 15 staff and community, happy holidays, happy and safe holidays, and we'll see you next year.
Let's hope there's school tomorrow because it's not too cold.
Yeah, watch for the messages, yes, yes. A motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned.